Good evening. I'm happy to welcome Professor Shevel from Tufts University. Thank you for being here. ICEUR is currently interviewing international experts in Ukraine and Russia. So you are an associate professor of political science at Tufts, the current president of the American Association of Ukrainian Studies, and an associate of the Harvard Ukraine Research Institute, and as well of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard. Well, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has started 3 weeks ago. Intense fighting is continuing all over the country. What is your assessment of the current military situation?
Right. Well, as you said, the current military situation is not going the way Russia had expected. They clearly planned a very short kind of blitzkrieg operation. Putin said before the invasion that occupation was not planned. Probably what the plan was to take out Kyiv government, to install some sort of puppet, and then, presumably rule from afar. Now that plan, of course, collapsed spectacularly. And I think if we look specifically at the Russian army problems that it's having and why it's not doing, as well as many expected. First of all, I'm not a military expert. I should make that clear. So the, military experts might give you different perspective. But to me, it seems two broader factors likely played a role. One is exactly this misperception that existed in Russia, including, for Putin personally, about Ukraine, how it's not really a real country, how people are ultimately not different from Russians, how they were expected to welcome Russian troops, and also this whole idea that Ukraine is really sort of a Western puppet. So whatever, is going on in Ukraine, it's kind of controlled by the West, and Ukrainians are really oppressed by this quote unquote Nazi government. So probably there was kind of overconfidence, as they say in any war. It's dangerous to underestimate your opponent or overestimate your own strengths. And I think that's exactly what happened in Russia. So there was probably the reports that Putin was receiving was more or less what he wanted to hear. I think it's no accident that there have been some purges and arrests within the FSB, the Security Services Department, responsible in part for providing intelligence on Ukraine. So I think they really kind of, assumed that they're going to do it very quickly. So the logistics was not put in place, right? And then they didn't expect to meet Ukrainian resistance that they did meet, because, not only the Ukrainian army became stronger since 2014, also there is great determination to fight because, people are fighting defensive war. There is a sense we're defending our right to live on our land. Now, and I think additionally, in Russia, there has been, and the army wouldn't be no exception to this, the corruption problem in Russia has been great, and everybody knows about it. And there have been reports which to me seem very credible, how, for example, the machinery was not properly maintained, that there was poor quality tires and things like that. And that's, again, very likely that the money that was invested in the Russian military modernization, substantial part of it was probably misappropriated and stolen, as again happens, in a corrupt system. So that was probably another factor that also further complicated logistical problems, overextension and overconfidence. So that's what I would say.
Thank you very much. So do you think that Russia will be forced to negotiate a peace agreement with Ukraine? And another question is, how would this determine the immediate future for Ukraine if it remains in the state, but it has to make some kind of concessions to Russia?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. I think at this point, it's hard to predict how it exactly would go. But I think what we do know by now that clearly the maximalist objective that Putin set for this war, which was essentially toppling of the government in Kyiv, the so-called denazification of Ukraine. And I think here it's important to keep in mind that, this whole rhetoric of denazification essentially means eliminating anybody and everybody who does not agree with, Russian and Putin's vision of history of Ukrainian-Russian relations. So it does not involve some, fringe far-right groups that exist in Ukraine. It literally involves from anybody from the Jewish president down to civil society activists, scholars, journalists, and so forth. So that grand goal, denazification, clearly is not happening. I think demilitarization, as he put it, another goal, I think is also not happening, because I don't think under any circumstances, unless Russia were to completely defeat Ukraine, which again, it doesn't look like it's capable of doing that Ukraine would somehow disband its army or, stop fighting, like that's also not going to happen. So now it means that Putin has to scale his demands So far, he hasn't done that officially, although there has been less talk about denazification lately. I mean, they still talk about demilitarization. It's not quite clear what it means, but at least the talk about the so-called denazification has been dropped. Now, if Ukrainian government stays in power, that essentially means that Ukraine as a sovereign entity continues to exist, because the plans to take Kyiv in 3 days has not happened, and now it looks increasingly unlikely that Kyiv could be taken, and therefore government toppled anytime soon, if at all. So now if we come to the point of negotiations, what could Putin essentially concede to still save face, right? And I think that's the answer. We don't know really the answer to this question, because officially he hasn't conceded anything. If, say, the demand were to be that, Crimea and the separatist controlled territories of Donbass were somehow remain under Russian control, well, that was the situation before the war. So why start the war to essentially go back to the status quo that existed before? I don't think Ukrainian government would formally recognize this annexation. I mean, they're not going to go into Crimea to try to fight over it. But, Russia de facto controlled it before the war, as well as the separatist regions in Donbass. So that also seems sort of, unlikely. Now, if Russia wanted Ukraine to concede, for example, the territories that it's now occupied temporarily in the south and northeast of the country, I don't think, and given sort of where the war is at the moment, that Ukrainian government would agree to this. Ukrainian president has been saying all this time that full withdrawal of the Russian troops from the territories that they entered since the war began is an absolute must. So again, unless there is defeat of Ukraine, which doesn't look like is going to happen, that maybe would be satisfactory for Russia if they, for example, took control of all of Donbass and southern and eastern and some northeastern parts of the country. There is no way Ukraine would agree to that. So if that was their negotiating position, I think fighting will continue. So to me, it really looks like there isn't really a good, at least in the short term, kind of face-saving decision for Putin. And if he is not really willing to withdraw and kind of go back to more or less status quo that existed before he started this war, I think the war is likely to continue, because the way Ukrainians look at it, they're fighting for survival, they're fighting for the right to exist as an independent nation in these supposedly pro-Russian regions that the Russian army entered so far. People have gathered, protested with Ukrainian flags. These are the most pro-Russian regions, supposedly. And even there, they're not getting any welcome. So to control these territories, they would have to occupy it militarily and sustain this occupation. They don't have resources for it. So I think really the question is how much more damage to Ukraine, to civilian infrastructure, to cities, towns, hospitals, can Putin do before it becomes clear that he really cannot win this war to him, because I don't think Russia really has a path to victory here. So I think that's where things stand at the moment.
Thank you for your assessment. Putin has also recently used extraordinarily strong language to refer to Russians who have sympathies for a Western way of living. So thousands of Russian citizens are already leaving the country every day. Is Putin preparing new repressive measures, and how could they look like?
Yes, I think it's definitely very, very likely. We already saw, the legislation passed that now makes it 15-year criminal offense of prison term for 15 years to criticize Russian military, to call the war. It became so Orwellian. They have arrested people who were protesting with blank piece of paper for defaming Russian armed forces. I mean, you can't really make it up. So I think we can definitely expect more repression in the Russian society. There already been repression going on for a long time. So any kind of systemic opposition, civil society opposition already has been crushed. And it seems like there is absolutely no indication that there would be any sort of lessening of repression, only strengthening of repression. I should also mention that now that Russia left the Council of Europe, or rather was going to be kicked out, but it left before it was formally kicked out, that also means that there is no longer a prohibition on the death penalty in Russia. So I wouldn't be surprised if death penalty was reintroduced in a very ominous kind of turn of events. The Russian TV channels, the talk shows that are all controlled by the government, have been airing public footage of public executions from the Second World War period, and basically talking about the guests on these talk shows, how they're planning to do these executions of the so-called Nazis in Ukraine. And that again goes to show that whatever territory of Ukraine Russia does occupy, we would see wide-scale repression there. But within Russia as well, I think we can expect to see tightening of the screws. Already any independent media is eliminated. So it is in a way sort of becoming like North Korea. I think the question is, would Putin be able to do this? Because of course, economy is hurting, population is being hurt, elites are being hurt. So I think that would be the intention, to kind of double down at home, to create even more repressive system. But I don't think it's absolutely certain that he would be able to sustain this long term.
Thank you. So more and more Western companies are leaving Russia, and it is excluded from many organizations. So how severely will Western sanctions affect Russia in the short and the long run? And which role could China play to compensate?
Yes, well, for the sanctions are clearly unprecedented. I mean, the Russian economy, which was, plugged into the global economy, was essentially unplugged overnight. And I think it creates quite substantial danger for Putin, because say this situation of now shortages, rising prices, right? People not being able to buy goods or services, or, McDonald's and so forth that they've been used to consuming before, could really create a problem as far as down the road, maybe not immediately, as far as societal support for the Putin regime, because he came to power and this whole calling card was how they brought stability, right? So sort of this contrast between 1990s in Russia, which were more democratic under Yeltsin, but also very chaotic, and the economy was in a terrible shape. There was hyperinflation, shortages of consumer goods and things like that. So then Putin kind of positioned himself as a leader who brought stability to Russia, brought wealth, rising wealth, availability of consumer goods. People of middle class could travel on vacation to Turkey and things like that. And now they no longer can do this. And it's very sudden. And I think it's different from the Soviet period, when, say, Soviet people were also deprived, there were shortages and so forth, but they had nothing else to compare it with. So they didn't go from sort of being able to enjoy these goods and services to then all of a sudden being cut off. It was kind of, you grow up in this deprivation, which I think is different from being, used to certain things and now not being able to access them. So I think that does put, again, pressure on the regime, at least in the medium term. The same we can say for the elites. The informal pact, to the we can call it that, with the elites, was that they can enrich themselves, especially those close to Putin, as long as they don't oppose the regime. So sort of for political compliance, the price, that, or the benefit that you get were all these yachts, vacations, houses in London and so forth. Now all of that is being taken from the elites as well. Again, does it mean that we're going to have a palace coup tomorrow? No. But we see these very important constituencies. On the one hand, kind of your average, Russian who was promised this continued and increased standard of living is now being basically cheated out of this promise. And on the other hand, another constituency, the elites, right, that are also essentially being cheated out of the deal that they were given, with Putin in power. So I think these are definitely, things to watch. I think we're just beginning to see the ramifications of it. It may not be even like a linear effect. It sort of may look like, the regime is holding on until it doesn't. So in a way, obviously, we don't know what's going to happen down the road, but I wouldn't exclude some sort of quite sudden collapse, potentially along many fronts. Maybe that would be issues in the army, when there would be mass refusal to serve, given, the casualties and how badly the army is doing. There would be some elite, dissatisfaction, potentially leading to some fractures there. And of course, how the public will react is also cannot be predicted. Could China compensate for this? I don't know. This is not my area of expertise, to be honest with you. So I can't, quite speak to that. But I think one important thing that I would point out, that China has an interest in being plugged into global economy. So China certainly wouldn't want to be sanctioned itself, right? And there is at least some uncertainty if China went clearly on the Russian side in support of Russia explicitly and sort of in defiance of these international sanctions and regulations and sort of global sentiment. It is running some risk. So I think Chinese leadership would be probably quite cautious, not to say that they wouldn't support Russia, but I think it would be too risky for them, it seems to me, to just completely say like, okay, we're going to side with Russia 100%. So we may see some sort of selective, maybe certain things. I think they're already providing these banking cards that work, the Chinese issuers and so forth. But I wouldn't expect kind of overwhelming, unambiguous support for Russia on the part of China.
Thank you. So millions of Ukrainians are forced to leave the country as refugees. What could Europe do to improve the humanitarian situation in Ukraine?
Yes, that's of course, a big humanitarian crisis. There are already over 3 million Ukrainian refugees who left. There are many more who are internally displaced within Ukraine who can still leave because people continue to cross the border. And of course, if the conflict grinds on and, the fighting moves to other parts of Ukraine that so far have not been affected by fighting, we can only expect to see even more people, leaving. In Europe, the response so far, of course, has been quite welcoming, both on the part of the population and on the part, as far as like legislation, simplified ways to receive status, legal status, ability to work, and so forth. But again, this is something that the welcome might wear off, right? How long can Europe sustain a country like Poland, which I think now hosts about 2 million refugees from Ukraine, right? Like that's not really, it puts a great strain on the countries along the EU border. I would say probably down the road, more burden sharing would be important because obviously countries closer to the border with Ukraine are more affected. These are also countries that are not as wealthy, especially if we look at places like Romania, Slovakia, right, that countries in Western Europe. So refugee burden sharing, I think, was always politically a very difficult issue in Europe because countries that are not as much affected didn't necessarily want to sort of voluntarily take on the burden. So I think, again, if this conflict grinds on and number of refugees does not decrease, but only increases, burden sharing, I think, would be really essential. But that said, most Ukrainians who left Ukraine, they do hope to come back. So for most people, they really see it as a temporary displacement as opposed to opportunity to move to the West permanently. So if hostilities do end in Ukraine, and Russians leave at least the territory that they entered since this war in February began, I think we will see a lot of Ukrainian refugees in Europe now moving back. So again, sort of the sooner the conflict ends, I think the easier it would be, obviously not just for Ukraine, but for Europe as well. So I think bringing this conflict to the end by putting pressure on Putin and supporting Ukrainian defense efforts is very important.
Thank you very much, Professor Shevel. Is there any additional point you would like to make in regards to the current situation?
Well, one thing I just want to sort of re-emphasize, to your listeners, is that really, as Ukrainians see it, it is existential fight for survival. So these sorts of, when we think about peace deals, right, like what would be reasonable, I would urge Western analysts and observers to really listen to Ukrainian voices, give them agency. People know what they're fighting for, what they're dying for. They don't want to live as slaves to Russia. And that's how they see it, right? So this determination to fight, I think really is grassroots. It is overwhelming. It unites the country. And I think Ukrainians should be given agency and a say in whichever way this conflict ends, and their position should be respected.
Thank you very much for sharing your point of view and giving us interesting insights into the present situation.
Thank you.